You can win the game. You can get the money, the respect, the metrics, the admiration. You can master the performance, play the character, beat the level, and still feel like a stranger in your own body. Here's the thing no one tells you about so-called success. The people clapping for you don't know who you are. They know who you present it as. And somewhere deep down, you know that too. Which means their approval doesn't land. Their praise feels like static. Their admiration? It goes to someone you're pretending to be. That's the quiet horror of winning without identity. You built everything, but you don't recognize the person standing on top of it. Because here's how the system works. It rewards your performance, not your truth. It celebrates image over essence, noise over stillness, reaction over reflection. You're taught to optimize your output, not question the direction you're sprinting toward. And if you dare to stop mid-chase and ask, wait, who am I, really? The game punishes you. Because the moment you start thinking like a real person instead of a role, your edge dulls. You hesitate. You detach. You remember you're not just a player, you're a soul.
Before we go further, a quick ask. If this already feels like I'm saying something you felt but never put into words, go ahead and like, subscribe, and share this video. That helps more people hear what no one else is saying. Wealth without self-awareness isn't freedom. It's ego dressed as success. Let's get into it. Let's start where most people end, the fantasy of arrival. You got the money. You're respected. You're the success story they show in slideshows at overpriced seminars. But when you wake up, the air feels stale. The silence is too loud. And your own reflection doesn't reassure you, it studies you like a stranger. Because deep down, you're not sure if the you they love is real, or if you just got really good at becoming what they wanted. The problem isn't money. Money's just a tool. But if you built your identity on being the guy who made it, you've trapped yourself in a paradox. Every dollar confirms your success, but every quiet moment confronts your confusion. Think about it. How many ultra-rich people spiral after reaching their goal? Not because they lost the money, but because they realized it didn't fix the part of them that felt broken.
Jim Carrey once said, "I hope everybody could get rich and famous and will have everything they ever dreamed of, so they will know that it's not the answer." That wasn't a soundbite. That was a confession. Because wealth amplifies your state of mind. It doesn't replace it. If you're anxious, insecure, or emotionally hollow, money just turns up the volume. Let's break this down even further. Say you've always felt like you weren't enough. So you hustle. You become obsessed with proving yourself. You master your craft. You build your empire. And it works. From the outside, you are enough. More than enough. But on the inside, you're not getting applause, you're getting addiction. You've wired your brain to only feel okay when it's chasing approval, dominance, or results. So you raise the bar. Again and again, until success isn't exhilarating anymore. It's just the next hit. And if you ever pause, you feel the crash, the identity void, the truth that your sense of self was a construction project, not a discovery. This is how ego traps you. It tells you you are your achievements. But what it means is you need your achievements to feel real. And that's where it starts to crumble. Because when identity becomes conditional, so does peace. So does happiness. So does your entire emotional ecosystem. Now, here's the disturbing part. The world loves this setup because it keeps you predictable, controllable, hungry. You'll buy more, work more, compete more. Because deep down, you're not chasing freedom, You're chasing a feeling you can't quite name, a sense of being real, of being seen, of being safe in your own skin. But safety doesn't come from applause. It comes from clarity. Let's go darker. The moment you arrive, your identity begins to rot, because the version of you that was built to climb has no idea what to do at the top. So it invents new problems, new enemies, new missions, anything to avoid sitting still with itself. Think about the billionaires obsessed with space, the CEOs who buy social media platforms just to be liked, the athletes who retire and spiral into chaos because without the game, they don't know who they are. That's not evolution. That's existential drift, and it happens to regular people too. The guy who finally gets the dream job then feels empty. The woman who hits her fitness goal but still hates her reflection. The couple who builds the perfect house then can't stand each other inside it. Because when you win without identity, the win doesn't satisfy. It haunts. It reminds you that all this effort didn't come from clarity. It came from fear, from confusion, from a need to feel worthy without ever asking, worthy to who? Let's pause here. You are not broken for feeling this way. You're not crazy. You're not ungrateful. You're just starting to see what most people avoid until it's too late. That what you really wanted wasn't wealth. It was wholeness. And you can't outsource that. You can't earn it. You have to remember it, piece by piece. By confronting the truth that the game you were playing never asked who you were, only what you could produce. So ask yourself, who are you if you stop performing? Who are you if you don't need to impress anyone? Who are you if nothing can be taken from you? That's where we go next.
Let's talk about the ego, not in the abstract, spiritual, kill your ego kind of way. Let's talk about what it actually does when you build wealth without knowing who you are. The ego's job is survival. That's it. And when it doesn't have a real identity to anchor to, it hijacks your wins and converts them into armor. Titles become shields. Possessions become proof. Followers become meaning. Attention becomes oxygen. It whispers, they love you, so you must matter. But what it's really saying is, don't stop performing or we'll both disappear. This is the trap of wealth without self-awareness. The external rewards start to feed a starving ego that grows more insatiable the more it consumes. It's not money addiction, it's identity addiction. The reason it's so subtle is because it hides behind success. You're winning, so no one questions your methods, not even you. You mistake the high of being admired for the peace of being whole. You conflate recognition with love. You start measuring your value by how much you have, not who you've become. And that works until it doesn't. Because here's the sick twist. Every ego high has a half-life. The first time someone calls you a genius, you feel electric. By the 10th time, it's normal. By the 100th time, you're secretly wondering why they don't say it anymore. That dopamine rush, it fades. That validation hit, it gets expensive. Your baseline resets and the bar keeps rising. This is how people with everything still feel like nothing. It's not because they're spoiled or dramatic, it's because they never dealt with the truth. They were building success to escape the self, not express it. Take a second and look at celebrities who spiral after peak fame. Not because they lost anything, but because they didn't know who they were once the spotlight moved. There's a story in psychology called hedonic adaptation, the idea that we return to an emotional baseline no matter how good or bad life gets. Lottery winners go back to being as happy or unhappy as they were before. Same with accident survivors. Wealth without inner work weaponizes that principle. You keep needing more, not because you're greedy, but because your ego keeps moving the goalpost.
And your sense of self is tied to chasing it, not catching it, chasing it. You've become an addict to becoming. And if you do stop, if you sit still enough, here's what happens. The questions come. The silence grows teeth. The distractions stop working. You might notice you don't laugh the same way anymore, or that your victories feel oddly muted, or that you're surrounded by people but somehow still feel alone. Because ego success is lonely. It always has been. Because it's not about being with people. It's about being above them. Even if you don't say that out loud, it's baked into the dynamic. And that creates another problem. The people who know the performance love you for it. But the people who see through it, they feel threatening. Even if they mean well. Because they don't admire your mask. They want to meet the real you. But you're terrified that without the mask, there is no real you. Just someone awkward, unsure, and deeply human. So you push those people away. You double down on achievement. You make your schedule airtight. You upgrade your environment. You convince yourself that more control equals more freedom. But deep down, you feel it. The more you curate your life, the more claustrophobic it becomes. That's not growth. That's ego panic. Let's get even more real. You're not actually afraid of failure. You failed before. You survived. What you're afraid of now is irrelevance, obscurity, being unseen, being ordinary. Because if you stop being impressive, what are you? If you don't post, don't perform, don't outshine, do you still matter? And if you do need to stay relevant to feel real, is that wealth? Or is that just a prettier kind of slavery? There's a reason so many wealthy people end up obsessed with legacy. It's not about impact, it's about identity insurance. It's ego trying to live forever. But here's the hard truth. No amount of legacy will fix a life lived by default. No statue will make peace with a soul that never felt safe being itself. No empire can protect you from the void of never knowing who you were beneath all that power. You want a chilling example? Look at Howard Hughes, billionaire, innovator, film producer, pilot, one of the richest men of his time. And he died alone in a hotel room, paranoid, mentally broken, fingernails uncut, surrounded by money, and absolutely no one who loved him as a person. Because the ego doesn't build a life, it builds a stage. And eventually the curtain falls. Now you might be thinking, what's the alternative? We'll get there, but first, you have to see what happens when your ego and your identity are at war. When the self you show the world is a carefully curated hallucination and your real self is buried under layers of performance. You don't have to be a billionaire to experience this. You could be a middle-level manager who got the corner office and now feels numb. An artist who built a brand but can't stand the person they play on camera. A YouTuber who built a brand but can't stand the person they play on camera. This isn't just a crisis of money, it's a crisis of meaning. Because if the ladder you climbed wasn't yours to begin with, then every step up just took you further away from yourself. And the scariest part, you didn't even notice, because the applause was loud enough to drown out the alarm bells until now.
Here's where it gets surgical. When your ego leads and your identity follows, you don't become more powerful, you become more dependent. Dependent on context, on perception, on audience. Your entire sense of self becomes reactive, fragile, shaped not by clarity, but by contingency. And nothing fuels this illusion like money. Because money doesn't just buy things, it buys roles. It lets you become whoever you need to be to feel safe. You can be the provider,
the genius, the outlaw, the icon, the rescuer, the untouchable. Each role offers an emotional reward, but each one also creates a mask. And the longer you wear that mask, the harder it becomes to remember what your own face even looked like. So let's name the central tension: power versus personhood. You start off thinking you want money to express who you are, but very quickly you start using money to protect who you're not allowed to be. Think about that. You buy freedom, but you feel more cornered. You gain options, but you lose spontaneity. You gain visibility, but become afraid of being seen. Why? Because your power isn't built on authenticity, it's built on strategy. You've curated an identity that's marketable, not livable, desirable, not durable. And now you're trapped inside a persona that performs well, but feels dead inside. This is how people become brands of themselves, polished, consistent, optimized for others, even when they're alone. This happens in subtle ways. The CEO who keeps his posture perfect even at home. The influencer who films a relatable vlog after 3 takes. The millionaire who jokes about burnout while quietly battling suicidal ideation. We confuse performance with presence. We become fluent in the language of being admired, but emotionally illiterate in the art of being real. Because here's the invisible consequence of winning without identity. You don't know how to exist without control. Let that sink in. If every room you walk into feels like a stage, if every friend feels like a potential threat to your image, if every compliment secretly stresses you out because now you have to maintain it, you're not living, you're managing. You've become an asset portfolio dressed in human skin. And here's the brutal irony. The more powerful you become in the world's eyes, the more invisible your real self becomes, even to you. Let's pull this apart with a real-world analogy. Imagine someone who grows up poor and vows to never feel powerless again. They grind, sacrifice, work 2 jobs, learn the system. Eventually, they make it big. Huge house, luxury car, lavish vacations. But what actually happened? They didn't become powerful. They just changed costumes. Because they're still reacting to fear. They're still defining themselves against powerlessness. So even though the surface changed, the core didn't. Their wealth is a shield, not a mirror. They're not living from the inside out. They're bracing from the outside in. That's not selfhood. That's trauma with a bank account. Now let's zoom out and talk about social dynamics. In any power hierarchy, there's a cost to being seen as the strong one. People stop being honest with you. They project their own fears and fantasies onto you. They either admire you too much or resent you too deeply. But either way, they stop relating to you as a person. You become a symbol, a projection, a concept. This is why power isolates, not because you're unkind, but because most people can't hold your humanity and your success in the same frame. And if you can't either, you start compensating. You start telling jokes to seem normal. You downplay your wealth to feel grounded. You overshare online to feel connected. But all of that is performance again. So the real question becomes, who are you when you're not trying to be impressive? If that question terrifies you, you're not alone. It terrifies most people because we've been trained to associate self-worth with status, not integrity, not intimacy, not alignment, just status. But identity isn't built on what you have. It's built on what you're willing to lose. And most people with power haven't lost anything that wasn't part of the script. They've risked money, risked attention, risked competition. But very few have risked honesty, the kind of honesty that could break their image, the kind that forces a reboot. Because ego says, don't change, just optimize. But identity says, burn it down if it isn't true. You can feel the difference. And that's the tipping point. At some stage, you will face a quiet rebellion inside you, a moment where your soul gets tired of pretending, where your persona starts to feel like a prison, where you fantasize about disappearing, not to run away from life, but to finally meet yourself. That moment matters, because it signals the beginning of something real. Not easy, not glamorous, but real. And if you can survive that identity fracture, if you can stop performing long enough to hear your own voice underneath the noise, you'll realize something that the ego can't survive in, but the self can thrive in. You were never supposed to build a life around being admired. You were supposed to build a life around being honest, even if that honesty costs you everything that made you feel powerful. Because real power doesn't come from being unbreakable. It comes from knowing who you are when you've already been broken, and still choosing truth over applause.
You know the worst kind of betrayal? Not when someone lies to you. It's when you lie to yourself long enough that you forget what truth ever felt like. That's what happens when you build a life around success without ever building a relationship with your own mind. The self gets buried under achievement. And the longer you stay on top, the more terrifying it becomes to dig down. Let's get brutally honest. You built the empire, but did you ever stop to ask who it was for? The truth is, a lot of people build their lives like PR campaigns, carefully structured, designed to be admired, optimized for reach, but empty at the core. Because the deeper reason behind their success isn't inspiration, it's avoidance. Avoidance of self-hatred. Avoidance of feeling powerless. Avoidance of being seen without the costume. So the wealth becomes insulation, a way to manage the chaos, not resolve it. You buy the house not to feel at home, but to signal that you belong. You wear the watch, not because you love time, but because it tells them how valuable you are. You fly private, not for peace, but for separation. But every layer of luxury, every inch of status just adds to the emotional architecture of a fortress you can't leave without disintegrating. You're not building freedom, you're building containment. Let's make this concrete. Imagine your life as a tower. The foundation is identity, your values, your inner compass, your understanding of who you are when nothing's at stake. But if you skipped that part, if you poured your energy into the walls, the windows, the rooftop pool, guess what happens the first time the ground shakes? Collapse. Because without identity, every level of success feels increasingly unstable. That's why some people get richer and more anxious, more paranoid, more obsessed with control. Because the higher they go, the harder they fall. And they know deep down they were never standing on solid ground. This is the hidden cost of self-betrayal. When you abandon your inner world to win in the outer one, you don't just lose authenticity, you lose access to joy, to rest, to genuine connection, to the quiet kind of confidence that isn't about being the best, but about being at peace. You've probably felt it. You've been at the party, you've made the speech, you've closed the deal. Everyone clapped, and then you went home and felt nothing. Not because you're ungrateful, but because the part of you that needed that applause is the part you've never actually let speak. And that voice, it doesn't care about your net worth. It's asking harder questions. Why does no one really know you? Why do you feel lonelier when you're winning than when you were struggling? What happens if you stop? What happens if you stop? Seriously. Pause there. What if you stopped chasing, stopped proving, stopped building for approval? Would your life hold together? Would your relationships still exist? Would you still exist? Or would the silence crush you? This is the question no one with power wants to ask, because they already know the answer.
The machine of success doesn't want you to stop. It needs your ego to keep running.
Because the moment you pause, the illusions start to break. And when they do, the grief comes. Grief for all the years you spent performing instead of living. Grief for the self you had to bury just to survive. Grief for the relationships you built on admiration, not intimacy. And maybe most painful of all, grief for the moments you were celebrated but completely disconnected from yourself. That grief is real and necessary. Because before you can build something real, you have to mourn what wasn't. This is where things get spiritual, not in a religious sense, but in an existential one. When the ego finally cracks, it doesn't scream, it whispers. And what it says is terrifying. I don't know who I am without this. That's the voice of your false self dying. It's not fun. It's not sexy. It won't get you a TED Talk. But it's the beginning of something sacred. A return to self. Not the self you learned to project. Not the one that's efficient, impressive, optimized. But the one that's quiet, curious, present, even vulnerable. And here's the twist. That version of you, the one you've buried, is the only one capable of experiencing true satisfaction. Because real peace can't be achieved through victory. It can only emerge when you stop needing to win. Let that sit for a moment. You've spent years chasing, climbing, conquering. But the deeper you go into this work, the more you realize the point was never to win the game. The point was to wake up in the middle of it and choose yourself instead. So now ask yourself, what have you built that would collapse if you started being honest? Which relationships would crack if you dropped the act? What part of your identity is being held together by admiration, not truth? You already know the answers. The question is whether you're ready to do something with them. Because your ego is comfortable. It knows how to play the role. But your real self, it's been waiting, not for applause, not for attention, just for a moment of your honesty.
Let's get into the collapse. You built your identity on being exceptional. You told yourself it was strength, discipline, drive. But underneath that structure, there's a darker truth. You were terrified of being ordinary, of being unremarkable, replaceable. So you turned your entire life into a performance of greatness. But here's the problem with performance. You can't stop. The applause fades fast, and the moment it's quiet, the questions flood in. That's when the prison reveals itself. Because once your self-worth depends on being impressive, rest becomes dangerous, honesty becomes sabotage, and authenticity becomes a liability. You're no longer free to be human. You're now managing a character 24/7, and that character doesn't get to fail, doesn't get to cry, doesn't get to be confused. It just keeps winning, or it dies. So what do? You keep chasing, you keep upgrading, you keep reinventing, and you tell yourself it's evolution. But what you're really doing is surviving. Let's look at this emotionally, not economically. There's a shift that happens after a certain level of success, something invisible but suffocating. At first, wealth gives you options, time, power. It feels like freedom. Then, slowly, it starts to calcify. You start choosing based on optics, not instinct. You hesitate before saying what you really think. You second-guess how on-brand your truth is. You ask your assistant to vet your dinner guests. You don't notice it happening, but inch by inch, the cost of maintaining your identity becomes higher than the joy of being yourself.
This is where you become emotionally bankrupt. Because wealth without identity doesn't just create ego, it kills curiosity. It rewards control, but punishes exploration. You become someone who already knows everything, who's always right, who's always sure. And the price? You stop growing. You stop being surprised. You stop feeling alive. You become a manager of your own mythology. Even worse, your relationships become transactional. People don't connect with you. They connect with your role, your power, your utility. And if they stop needing you, they disappear. So what do? You over-deliver. You make yourself useful. You become addicted to being irreplaceable. Not because you love service, but because if you're not needed, you're nothing. That's the emotional hell of identity built on wealth. You gain the world, but lose your reflection. And the world claps anyway, because from the outside, you're crushing it. The highlights look beautiful. The metrics say you matter. But inside, you're terrified because you know the house is made of sand. Let's go darker. The more power you gain, the harder it becomes to tell the truth, not just to others, but to yourself. You start rationalizing everything. I'm just being strategic. This is part of the hustle. People don't need to see everything. But that's not strategy, that's fear. You're afraid that if people saw the full picture, the moments of doubt, the lack of joy, the emotional emptiness, they'd realize the truth, that the life you've built is airtight, but not alive. Here's how this plays out. You wake up with a schedule filled to the brim. You keep your body optimized, your mind sharp, your habits perfect. You don't even feel the stress anymore. It's become your default. And at night, you scroll, you numb, you distract. You say you're relaxing, but what you're really doing is hiding from the silence, from the sadness, from the deep, agonizing realization that you're not happy and you don't know how to be. Because being happy would require being honest, and being honest would require risking everything. That's the trap. When your wealth becomes your only identity, it also becomes your only anchor. And if it ever wobbles, if the market crashes, if the public turns on you, if the business folds, you don't just lose money, you lose your entire sense of self. You become nothing. That fear, it's paralyzing. It's why some wealthy people never retire, never slow down, never tell the truth. Because the moment they do, the mask falls off, and there's no one underneath it who feels real. Now let's be even more precise. This isn't just about billionaires and celebrities. This is about the manager who's terrified of losing her job because it's the only place she feels respected. The father who overworks to provide but hasn't had a real conversation with his kids in months. The young entrepreneur who's more afraid of losing status than he is of losing his soul. We've all played this game because society rewards the performance, but your psyche pays the price. And eventually, the debt comes due. You burn out. You implode. You sabotage. Or, if you're lucky, you wake up. You see the pattern. You name it. You stop pretending that success equals selfhood. And when that moment hits, it doesn't feel triumphant. It feels like grief, like standing in the ruins of everything you built and realizing none of it ever held you. And now you have a choice. Keep performing, keep managing the image, keep living in a luxury cage, or let it fall apart. Let the applause fade. Let the real self emerge, messy, unoptimized, painfully honest. Because that's the path to freedom. Not more strategy, not more control, not more validation, but reconnection with who you are when there's nothing left to prove.
Wealth without identity is a performance. It's exhausting, but it pays until it doesn't. And most people never quit the act, because becoming rich is hard, but becoming real, that's terrifying. It means unlearning the scripts you used to climb the ladder, killing off the personas that made you liked, respected, feared. It means stepping away from the applause long enough to realize how fake it all feels. It's spiritual work, psychological surgery. You can't outsource it, and there's no shortcut. You have to sit with the emptiness wealth didn't fix. You have to peel back every layer of performance until you find the scared, unloved version of you who chased success just to feel enough. And then what? You rebuild. Not as a brand, not as an archetype, but as a person. That's what it means to have wealth with identity. You're not just rich, you're real, and you're finally free from the game that once owned you.